Today we are delighted to hear from a man who does not shy away from the forces of evil, but makes a living knowing and sharing all he can about the dangers of terrorism. From 1994 to 1998, Terry Turchi directed the Unabomber Federal Task Force, which led to the capture of Theodore Kaczynski. He was then tasked by the FBI Director Louis Freeh to hunt for the Olympic Park bomber. Terry served from 1999 to 2001 as Assistant Deputy Director of the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI, where his investigations led him to the Middle East, Asia, and the former Soviet Union. He then worked as the Director of Counterintelligence and Counterterrorism for the University of California, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He has co-authored several books, including Breaking Iraq, Hunting the American Terrorist, and Homeland Insecurity, How Washington Politicians Have Made America Less Safe. An expert on national and international crime and terrorism, he is very well regarded by his colleagues, a couple of which are in the room today, or a couple of whom are in the room today, receiving awards from both the FBI and Attorney General for outstanding service. Terry is now a principal at TK Associates, serving as a consultant to both corporations and law enforcement, as well as news organizations, including Fox News. This is a guy you'd want to have a beer with. As I corresponded with Terry to arrange today's programs, I got more and more curious. I realized that while he lives and breathes one of the most difficult, horrendous topics that a person could focus a career on, he was delightfully positive. I couldn't wait to meet this optimistic warrior. Please help me welcome one of our good guys, a new friend to SVRW, Terry Turchi.
Good morning, thank you. Yes, I was delightfully positive because I knew I was going to get a free breakfast today. And anyone who knows FBI agents know they love to get a free breakfast or lunch or something. I have to tell you before I start talking, since Election Day, wherever I go, whether it's a little town or a little city or stopped at the toll booth at the bridge or anywhere in the country just about, it's very, very interesting. Without even asking somebody, once you look at someone's face, immediately you can tell if they're Republican, because since Election Day, they've had these huge, huge smiles all across their face. And no matter where you are, you see that. But I bet that all of you, or a lot of you in here, have worked very hard over the last year, and congratulations on what happened. It fooled everybody. It certainly fooled the brilliant analytical people at all of the major media stations. And that takes a lot, and that's because of all the hard work you did. And I think that certainly as a former law enforcement officer, a former FBI agent, I'm actually very delighted that Donald Trump is the President of the United States. And so now, not being in the FBI, you can actually come out and say that, and it feels really, really good. So thank you for having me here today to talk about terrorism in the Silicon Valley. The topic of terrorism is so broad and so wide, and people have so much to ask and so many questions, that what happens in these talks is usually I end up talking too long, and then you don't get enough time to ask questions and go in whatever direction you want to go. So what I'm going to do is work really hard today to try to kind of keep this initial talk to 30 or 40 minutes so that you can take this wherever you want and we can have a lot of interaction about anything you want to ask about terrorism or about some of the things that are issues today in our country that pertain to the FBI and terrorism. So keep an eye on me, Jane. And make sure you stop me if I am over that 40-minute limit. So let's start with Silicon Valley. And let's just get really close to home and try to assess what kind of threat and what kind of things you're going to face in the future here if everything that's in front of us looks like it's a good forecast of what's to come. So let's get out on the road and go about 15 minutes south of here, where we're standing right now, to a place called Coyote Park. Have any of you ever been down in that direction? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about is you go down there on 85 and you kind of turn towards the west and towards the mountains, and it becomes more and more wilderness. You come to a place called the PG&E Metcalf Substation. That's just 15 minutes from here. That's not very far. That's right in our neighborhood. Back on April 16 of 2013, in the early morning hours, sometime after about 1 a.m., some unknown assailants attacked the PG&E substation there. They fired well over 100 rounds from a 30 caliber or 30 caliber rifles into the substation, hitting 17 transformers, and causing the plant to basically shut down. And a lot of the places that were getting power and energy from that station were shut off for quite a while. And that attack took all of 19 minutes and did $15 million worth of damage, and certainly affected a lot of people that lived and worked down here in Silicon Valley and some of the neighborhoods closer to it. Now, that was almost 4 years ago, and that case today remains unsolved, despite the fact that during those 4 years, PG&E and a couple of other places have put out rewards for about $250,000 each. So there's almost a $1 million total of rewards out for any information leading to the people who attacked the substation, and yet no dice, no bite, no calls. And PG&E was, of course, raked over the coals for that attack, and they were called in front of all kinds of commissions. And they promised, and everybody else promised that was connected with that, to make sure that they would secure that place and that that would never happen again, and that the PG&E itself would start to spend more money on these isolated substations where really all of our power and our energy come from, because they're very, very vulnerable. Well, sadly, about a year later, about 18 months later actually, 18 months from that April 2013 attack, someone decided they wanted some power tools that were inside the gates of those facilities. So they cut a hole in the fence, and they walked in there, and they took the power tools, and they left. And that case also, after all that talk and money, today is still unsolved to my knowledge. No photographs of those people, no alarms went off, no clue as to who did that. So when we talk about vulnerabilities and we talk about the fact that we're in the economic engine of California, and some might argue the economic engine of America, and our country has spent billions and billions of dollars since 9/11 on security and to try and deal with these vulnerabilities. And we saw that attack at PG&E, even though today they don't know if that's terrorism or sabotage or some sort of inside job or vandalism. It's a little bit of a big number to be a vandal. But the problem with these things is that they're very complicated, they're very tough, and when you get involved in one, you literally have the universe of people out there as potential suspects in something like this. But today, in a day of international terror, regardless of who was responsible for that attack, think about it. Do you think Al-Qaeda is watching that and looking at that and learning from that and determining if, hey, that works for us if we want to start targeting places like that? Do you think ISIS is looking and watching and learning and maybe planning to recruit lone wolf targets or lone offenders who can do things like that, knowing that that happened, and today all that manpower, all that money, and all that work is still unsolved as of today? So that kind of, I hope, will put you in the right framework, the right frame of mind, to let you know that is Silicon Valley a target of terror? Absolutely. Is Silicon Valley vulnerable to international terror, to countries who sponsor terror, and to the lone actor? Absolutely. There's no question that regardless of whether or not that attack on the PG&E substation was a terrorist attack, we know that the terrorists are watching, waiting, listening, and if they get an opportunity to do something like that and find the right people that have the desire to pull it off, they'll do it. So let me tell you why I'm so positive of that, and I want to take you back to another example that actually spans several years, actually almost a decade, and will put you, I hope, in the middle of several cases that were going on during this particular period of time. But the whole message I want to give you or relay to you when we get to this story is that it's going to come right back here, right to Silicon Valley, and it will indicate and I think clearly show you the kind of threat we face, the kind of threat we face as a country, and the kind of threat you might face individually as you go about your work and your life here in Silicon Valley. I want to take you back to 1981. That's a long time ago. But a fellow named Ali Muhammad, who's was an Egyptian citizen, in 1981 made a decision to join a group called the Egyptian Islamic Jihad while he was over in Egypt. Little did he know at that time where that path would take him, But he got to know an individual who he started doing some work for in Egypt. The guy's name was Ayman al-Zawahiri. And Ayman al-Zawahiri was an Egyptian doctor. And he had created or had a lot to say in the development of this group, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And so when Ali Muhammad got to know him, he started doing little jobs for him, things such as traveling to countries like Kenya and Tanzania in Africa and kind of scoping out certain places to see if they might be good targets in the event that you might want to commit some sort of act of violence against a particular target. He went to these places to look to the possibility and the opportunity of creating cells of people who might be willing to join al-Zawahiri in committing attacks of violence against certain targets in those countries. And he figured out and actually showed al-Zawahiri how you can create phony identification so that you can leave one country and get into another country without being picked up and leave no trail. So he was a real expert at false documents, fake ID, and getting from one country to another by getting through an immigration system. All of these things he learned as he was also a member of the Egyptian army. Now, because Egypt and the United States at that time had a great relationship, and it was getting better and better with Anwar Sadat, who you might remember, some of you, who was the president of Egypt at the time, they decided that in the Egyptian army, this man is so good at his job here in the army that we think we'll send him to Fort Bragg in North Carolina in America. So they did. They sent him, and we decided to put him here when he got to the States, into the Advanced Special Warfare Service of Fort Bragg, where he was a great guy. He was able to use his knowledge of Egyptian culture and his knowledge of the Arab language to teach people in the army about their culture and to travel to New York and kind of interact with immigrant communities in New York City. Now, kind of fast forward as he's going back and forth on airplanes and having these visits with the army and meeting all kinds of people and training all kinds of people, he's still working for Ayman al-Zawahiri. He's still going back to him and saying, look who I met, look who I found, look who I know in New York in the Arab immigrant community, look who I know in North Carolina in the army, and look who I've learned to know because in 1985 he got to know a lady on an airplane flight from Santa Clara County. She was a medical assistant. She took a liking to him as they talked on this flight. And they began a whirlwind romance that led to a marriage later in 1985 in Reno, Nevada. And at that time, he decided, I'm done with Egypt, and I've got a lot of things going on, so I think I'll travel over here and I'll become a U.S. citizen now that I'm married to a U.S. citizen. So he came to the Silicon Valley, and they lived a very peaceful and quiet life in a duplex, again, not far from where we're standing today. And he wanted to get a job here. He really did want to go to work in the Valley, but he couldn't find the right job for him. So he decided, I know, I've got an idea. I'll join the American Army. So he joins the U.S. Army, and they're delighted to have him. Guess where they send him? They send him back to Fort Bragg from Silicon Valley here, and they say, you can do exactly what you were doing before. You can recruit. You can go out and talk to soldiers. You can train all of our people in Middle Eastern culture, in the language. You can teach them all the things you know. And over in another part of his life, Ayman al-Zawahiri was telling him the same thing for a totally different reason and a totally different purpose. So we have a man who made his way from Egypt in 1981, by 1985, right here in the middle of us, living where his neighbors said, this is a great guy. This man is quiet and peaceful and wonderful. And he was. He was very friendly, very outgoing, and he was a terrorist for what was going to become Al-Qaeda. In fact, his wife would later say, yes, I know FBI. He spent a lot of time traveling. He spent a lot of time on the road. But look, he couldn't find a job here that he wanted, so he had to get in the Army. He then, when he left the Army in 1989, wanted to try and get a job in the FBI as an interpreter. For some reason, that didn't work. Thank God. But then he decided, well, I have contacts in Egypt, so I'll go and I'll just kind of get into that job again. And so he did. And all I knew is that he was working for some guy he met over there whose last name was Bin Laden. So that was what his wife had to tell the FBI, and every day he was here, every contact he was having with the Army, and every day he was in the Silicon Valley, when he was meeting you and me and people like us, he was recording that name. He was talking about where those people worked. He was putting together information that made its way back way long before 9/11 into the coffers of Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, his lieutenant, and the organization we would all soon come to know as Al-Qaeda. Now, in 1989 and into about 1991-95, to the 95 time frame, he started doing a lot more travel to New York. And as he traveled to New York to meet the immigrant community up there, and a lot of this was from his Army days with the U.S. Army, he also ran into some people up there that were doing work for Mr. bin Laden. One guy in particular, a guy named, who will be a familiar name to you, a guy named Abul Rahman, Omar al-Murabin. And this man was a sheikh in Jersey City. And Omar actually had lost his vision because of an incident he'd had involving explosives. And he was known as the blind sheikh. And he became somebody who was well known to Ali Muhammad, this man I'm talking to you about. And they started striking up a friendship. And that's a very important thing. Keep Abdul Rahman's name in mind, because by 1993, on February 26, which just about every one of you probably in this room remembers, in the morning hours of on Eastern Time, a guy named Ramzi Youssef rented a Ryder truck and drove it into the level B2 basement of the World Trade Center. And the whole idea of driving that truck in there and parking it, he had a Confederate with him in the passenger seat, a guy named Yassin, who was also the bomb maker, was that Ryder truck was basically a 1,300-pound uric acid bomb. And the whole idea was, if we park this truck by this particular parking area and this explosion goes off, he had equipped himself with 20-foot fuses, then he's going to collapse the North Tower into the South Tower and cause the entire World Trade Center complex to crash into the ground on that morning of February 26th. So they pulled off their plan without a hitch. They drove the yellow Ryder truck into the basement, and then they took off, and they detonated the bomb. And it was a sad event, but we were also very, very fortunate, as you find with a lot of these terrorism events. He hadn't parked the truck quite in the right spot. So when part of this collapse occurred, and it wasn't really a collapse, part of this detonation occurred, it just missed its mark on this pillar by the North Tower where he was really targeting. There was a lot of concrete. This was the main weakness of this building, or the strength, you may call it. But he just missed his mark. And so the detonation didn't have the effect it had, or it was intended to have. So what he did is he took off out of there that morning. He got back to an apartment in Jersey City, and then Ramzi Youssef decided, I got to get out of the country. Within 24 hours, he was on a flight, and he was over in Pakistan. His driver, Yassin, or his passenger that day, Yassin, and his bomb builder, who was with him, lived in another apartment down the hall from him in Jersey City, lived in the apartment of his mother. So he stayed there, and there was one other player here that was very vital, in fact, extremely important, a guy named Salima. And Salima had actually had the job of renting the Ryder truck at a location in Jersey City so they could build a bomb in it. So as he goes to rent the truck and they do their bombing, the explosion occurs. The ATF, the FBI, the NYPD, all of these law enforcement agencies, of course, converge on the World Trade Center. In the midst of the rubble and the metal and all of the other debris, there's a piece of a Ryder truck. And that small piece of Ryder truck had a VIN number on it. They were able to trace the VIN number to the rental agency that Mr. Salema had gone to rent the truck. So they went over and they had some contact with the rental agency. They remembered the rental. but they said the car had been reported stolen. So they didn't have the car back, and of course the records they had for who rented it were all messed up. So there was not much help they could provide, but they did say, if we hear or we see any of these people again, we'll give you a call. Mr. Salema decided, I'd like to get my deposit back on my rental truck. So a few days after everything had calmed down, he thought, I'll go back to Jersey City and I'll tell him I want my deposit back on that truck that was stolen. So he did. And he was led away in handcuffs because he was met at the door because the rental agency did the right thing. This is a recurring theme that I want to make sure when we leave here today and we leave each other that I keep saying to you and you keep remembering. None of these cases, whether they are preventions of terrorism acts or whether they are terrorism cases that have come together, none of these cases would have ever happened and been successful or been solved or prevented had it not been for help from you, from people in the community, from local law enforcement, from people out there that trusted their instincts or got involved and did something and provided the last piece of information that helped bring something together. Every example I give you here today, you're gonna realize that, wow, this really works. It's not them. All they do is act as the agents to bring together the forensic information and the interview information and all the analysis that leads to the trail. But you all provide that trail. And so keep that in mind, because when we get to the end here, you're going to want to know, what can we do? What you can do is always trust your instincts. Everybody has them. And what we found over the years, I'll just deviate for a minute. What we found over the years, it's not that people don't get suspicious. It's not that everybody kind of has a sixth sense. What happens is people have an instinct, and then something kicks in their brain, and they talk themselves out of trusting the instinct, and they decide, oh, that's nothing. I'm getting paranoid. I'm not going to bother them with that. So remember, bother somebody if you have an instinct. At an airport, you see a backpack out somewhere. So let me go back to this story. So Salam is taken in. That leads to the identification of Ramzi Youssef, and they find out Ramzi Youssef is in Pakistan. But that then leads to something else. It leads to developing the name, first time for the Bureau, of Ali Muhammad, this guy in Silicon Valley. So they start kind of unwinding the string, and they knock on Mr. Muhammad's door out here. He says, oh yeah, thanks for coming. I used to be in the U.S. Army. In fact, I'm an American citizen now. I came from Egypt. Well, that's great. Well, maybe you can help us. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Middle Eastern culture. Oh, Mr. Muhammad was glad to do that. I wanted to be an FBI interpreter. So let's talk. So for the next 4 years, and I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but it happens, because this is the world we work in. It's the world we live in. The FBI did its vetting of him, and it seemed to go okay, but at the same time, Mr. Muhammad was talking to the FBI, helping the FBI, giving a little bit of information here and there about the people he'd come across, but not giving all of the information by a long shot. Because while he was saying he was helping the FBI, he was still working for bin Laden and al-Zawahiri and al-Qaeda. By 1998, the entire country here has changed because of what has happened in terrorism. And in 1998, in August, 2 of our embassies were bombed in Kenya and Tanzania. As the FBI began investigating that and developing significant evidence that that was an al-Qaeda plot designed to kill Americans and injure Americans, they also came across in New York the name of Ali Muhammad. And right away, wait a minute, we know Ali Muhammad. Well, it turns out that we didn't know him like we thought we did. And Ali Muhammad was arrested along with 22 other people, and he ended up at that point in time deciding, okay, I'll go the full route here now because I'm facing life in prison or maybe the death penalty. So I'm going to help the FBI, and I'll tell them what I know. And so he went back and said, those early days as I was becoming a citizen, and it was kind of right after the assassination of President Anwar al-Sadat in Egypt, and I got involved in this Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Well, as those years went by, I did a few things I didn't tell you about. For example, arranged for Ayman al-Zawahiri, with that phony name and phony identification, to kind of float through the Silicon Valley on a fundraising mission. Now, this is different than when, like, President Obama comes out here on a fundraising mission. This is Ayman al-Zawahiri coming out here to collect money to finance his terrorist acts. And that's exactly what he did. He was out here as a guest of Ali Muhammad. And rolled through here in 94, 95, and also went to Sacramento and did the same thing. So all this was pulled together, and a number of these people were indicted, convicted, and sent off to prison. And Ali Muhammad spent some time in prison, but obviously got, and he's still there, but he got a lot of his life sentence reduced because of the help that he gave in that embassy bombing plot. But while he was doing this, he was researching and giving names and locations and addresses to Al-Qaeda of people living right here in Silicon Valley. This goes all the way back to the 1980s and the early 1990s. Silicon Valley has been looked at, has been evaluated, and has been on the target list for many, many years of these international terrorist groups. And some of these things that happen in other cities, while we haven't had a major terrorist attack here, you can trust me that they know the layout, they know the companies, they know the places. And they're not the only ones. In 1995, the Unabomber, 18 years it took us to find the Unabomber, to identify, to have a name. But in the summer of 1995, while we were dealing with international terrorist issues and had dealt with the collapse of the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, the Unabomber was getting ready to start talking to the media and start talking to the public, because he had a big idea. He was really anti-technology, and he was going to write this manifesto and send it to the world and tell everybody how anti-technology he was, and use that as the reason for him committing 16 bombings over 18 years, beginning in May of 1978, the longest running serial bombing case in the history of the FBI that went unsolved. And so during this time, as we reach 1995, he sends letters to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now, the Unabomber lived in the middle of nowhere in Montana, the middle of nowhere. There's a little library there that he went to do research. He sat in a corner. He did, every day he went in and he did all his work and checked the news to see what was going on, if his bombings were reaching their targets and all of that kind of thing. But he also checked on people to get addresses to use as return addresses on his envelopes when he would send bombs to places, and on his letters. And in the summer of 1995, on a letter to the Washington Post, he had a return address of Boone Long Ho with his residential address on the envelope here in San Jose. Boone Long Ho was a real person. He was the chief financial officer of a company called GAA Array Technology here in San Jose. And he was an actual individual. And the Unabomber had come up with his name, researching, and then ended up putting that on as a return address. On another device, he had the address of Calgene, which is a high-tech company that deals in genetically manufactured plants up in Davis. So he'd pull that out and use that as a return address. So again, not just international terrorist, but a lone offender like the Unabomber was researching, coming up with stuff, and putting it to use in his plots to attack various people. So again, another example of the Silicon Valley, never very far from the minds of these people. After 9/11 and by 2003, we were getting much better at sending out information, much better at collecting information from overseas. So we had a better idea as to the terrorist targets by about that time. And so there was a publication that came out. California Department of Homeland Security got a hold of it, and it listed all of the targets in the Bay Area, all of the targets in California. There were 624 separate targets listed on this document in California that had come to the attention at that time of Al-Qaeda. They included the Transamerica building, all of the major airports in this region. It included some of the, believe it or not, they were even interested in where we raise vegetables and crops, some of these places down on the fringes of the Silicon Valley in the agricultural belt. and the Port of Oakland, and the Silicon Valley. In fact, a police sergeant from San Jose who had seen the list and who was dealing with all of the things every day by day, to try to determine what kind of risk he faced out here, said that, look, you can bet that there's two places in the California area, or in California, that are going to be targets of terrorists, and that is the Bay Area in general, and certainly the Silicon Valley in particular. So this has never been far from anybody's mind. It's never been far from the terrorist minds. And if you go back just a year ago to the Super Bowl 50, I think it was, all of the work and the effort that went into securing Super Bowl 50 was like none other. But it goes back to about 1996, when we had the Olympic bombing in Atlanta, and the idea that, look, we're no longer, no matter what we're going to do, we're no longer going to be safe from some of these people, whether they're a lone offender, or they're an international terrorist, or they belong to a terrorist organization. So we're going to have to do a lot more and spend a lot more money to get ready for these events. Special events today and special event planning is a major area of preventing terrorist acts. It took at least a year ahead of time to start planning for the security that surrounded Super Bowl 50. Any major sporting event today, same thing. The Olympics or anything else, you're going to have a huge amount of law enforcement presence about a year or two ahead of time. The inaugural that occurred just the other day. When I was getting ready to leave the Bureau, or was in my last year, in fact, I had the wonderful experience of being there as the Deputy Assistant Director, and President Bush was getting ready to come into office. And so we had the command post up and running to support the security for his inaugural. And in those days, even before we had the kind of thing we have going on now, we were still worried about the terrorism threat, about the protest threat, and about all the possible things that could happen along the parade route. So you bring in agencies of every part of government in one place. They all have their own place in these huge rooms, and you follow all of those days' activities, and it takes tremendous amount of time and effort to pull all that together. But that's what they do on all these things these days because of what we face from overseas. I think that, I don't know how much time we've gotten into, but I want to talk about one more thing to illustrate why this whole idea of vulnerability and why this whole idea of these people never give up, these terrorists never give up. I want to use the Olympic bombing of 1996 in Atlanta. A lot of planning went into that. And as they were planning it, they decided that, we've got to have a place somewhere here in the Olympic venue where people can kind of come and go, and they don't have to worry about security cameras, and they don't have to worry about being stopped at checkpoints, and they don't have to worry about their backpacks being checked, because we want them to enjoy these events. So there was one little place that was kind of carved out of the Olympic Park venue so that people could just go there and kind of unwind. They could buy beer, they could have fun, they could make lots of noise, and it was called Centennial Olympic Park, and it was kind of carved out in amongst all of the Olympic venue. You could walk right up, walk right in there. Now, anywhere else, you had to go through checkpoints, you had to, there were cameras, there was a lot of security, but not here. On that day in July, Eric Robert Rudolph, who had built a bomb using dynamite on a big metal plate and built it into a backpack, found exactly the one place at the Olympics that was vulnerable that he could walk into with that bomb. He wasn't stopped, he wasn't checked, nothing happened, he wasn't on a camera, and he walked right in there to a park bench, and he took his backpack off. He made a huge bomb in there involving multiple pieces of dynamite, and he stuck the backpack on a bench where he set it up right. A few minutes went by, and some guys that were like doing exactly what they were told they could do, really letting their hair down, came into that area, and they were all wearing, there were 7 of them, they were all wearing Speedo bathing suits. That's all they were wearing. And they all had beer, and they were having a great time, and they're literally wandering around this bench. Now, how do we know that? Because as part of that investigation after the fact, there were no cameras formally in there, but we talked to hundreds and hundreds of people. Some people took film. Some people took video. Some people took pictures. We collected thousands of pieces of video and pictures, and we're able to put a composite together of all the activity there. And on the back of photos, you have a time of when it was developed and taken and everything. So we have all this stuff. So we pulled it all together, and we identified these 7 guys in Speedos. And we see the park bench in this one piece of film. And so we call these people the Speedo 7. That's how we came up with that. So anyway, so now we decide we got to identify all these people. And we did. We identified the Speedo 7. Why were they so important? Because on one piece of film, as these guys were horsing around and they were only there a few minutes at this park bench, one of them, the backpack kind of gets in his way. And he takes the backpack and he picks it up, and then he decides, gee, this is heavy. And when he puts it back down, he sits it down this way. Just a few minutes later, those guys left. The backpack detonated. There was shrapnel in the backpack intended to, when the bomb detonated, go into the the atmosphere here and spread out over a very huge radius. Because of the way they set that pack down, that didn't work exactly right, and it probably saved literally hundreds of people from being killed as the shrapnel spit out over the crowd. So those guys didn't know it, but they became kind of real heroes. My point is this. Terrorists are going to find the vulnerabilities that they want to find. They're always researching. They're always studying. They know the Silicon Valley. Just the other day, let me back up by a year. In 2015, in 2 different issues of Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine, they had pictures of Silicon Valley and high-tech executives. In one of those magazines, they had a cover photo of Bill Gates. And then they had kind of separate photos of like a guy that was in a thing with a hooded sweatshirt and aviator sunglasses. And he's kind of stalking this house of this supposedly wealthy guy. And this is what you get from looking at this picture. And then you see blood spatters and you see weapons. And the whole idea being, we're gonna kill this high-tech guy. In another edition of Inspire magazine, they actually named Mr. Gates. They named Warren Buffett. They named Michael Bloomberg and a couple of other people. So they're always looking, and they're always out there waiting for the opportunity to do something. And today, we have a particularly bad situation that's kind of building. And that is that all those years that we were looking for the Unabomber, the lone offender, we knew very little about lone offenders. But we later learned that one of the things that these people have in common, fortunately there aren't a lot of them, but the lone shooter, the lone bomber, the lone offender, these people all their life, they wanted to belong to something greater than themselves. They wanted to be part of a cause. And they were never able to find that cause, and they were never able to find that group. In fact, some of these people had tried to join really violent groups, and we later had some of the people in those groups tell us, that guy was here, but that guy really believed this stuff, and he was so violent, we asked him to leave. And that's a true story in at least 2 instances. So these are people that have all kinds of anger. They want to belong, and they can't. So they create their own group. Theodore Kaczynski created the terror group FC. There was no terror group FC. It was just him. Eric Rudolph said, I'm with the army of God. But really the army of God is just like 3 words. The guys that use the army of God as their umbrella to do terrorist acts are saying, I'm part of that group. So what happens? Today, we have ISIS come along. ISIS is obviously heavily into the social media. They perfected this like Al-Qaeda never could and never did. And they're now using that to find these lone offender mentalities. So what we have coming in front of us here in the coming weeks and months and years, and it definitely clearly illustrates that we have to have different strategies to deal with terrorism, is we have a dead-on collision between international terror and domestic terror in the form of these lone offenders. And what do the lone offenders want? They want to be part of a group. What does ISIS provide? What does Al-Qaeda provide? What do these places provide? They provide a group and a cause. And you don't even have to be together. You never have to even meet each other to listen to an ISIS message. Take your ideas, take your weapons, take whatever you can get your hands on, and go out and find what you can gain access to and do your thing. And that's exactly when you started naming, whether it's Omar Mateen in Florida at the Pulse nightclub, or it's this man Santiago at the Fort Lauderdale airport. These people needed a cause. They needed something to get them motivated. They found it, and then they committed the acts they committed. And sadly, in more than one of these instances, to bring this full circle, I'm telling you, I'm asking you to look for indicators of problems, but these people had actually come across the FBI's radar, had actually sometimes been interviewed. The Boston Marathon bombers a few years earlier had been interviewed by FBI agents. The problem with all of that is the FBI takes a snapshot in time. It decides if there's a risk. It can only go so far with some of these people because of our entire set of civil liberties and principles here in America, and then they have to move on after they've made a decision. And that snapshot in time may not catch what somebody thinks about and ends up doing 3 or 4 years later. And in almost all of these, you see this happening. So we have real challenges ahead of us, but no matter what those challenges are, I have to emphasize this again, all of these cases, just about all of them, come together when people like you see things, hear things, get suspicious, and decide, I'm going to pick up the phone and call somebody. And so I would encourage you to think about that. I would encourage you to think about the idea that Silicon Valley clearly is a target of terrorists, both domestic and international. And these cases are so complicated and so involved that even something like the attack on the Metcalf station, 4 years later, can go unresolved and unsolved. I'm probably already over 40 minutes, but thank you.
Terry's agreed to take a lot of questions if we have them, so a couple of requests from me. One is, please, if you have a question, make it a question, not a monologue. Make it brief so that we can get as many in as possible. Also, please, yes, actually, that's what I was going to say, is please stand and speak as loudly and clearly as you can so that Terry doesn't have to constantly repeat their questions and we'll be able to get through more. And I'm going to take my privilege as the outgoing vice president and ask you the first question. Could you speak to the price of political correctness in terms of American safety?
When you talk about political correctness, I think really down below the surface, one of the real reasons that Donald Trump won the election is that we were all starting to feel so under the thumb of people who were ready to call us names and jump all over us if we said something or express thoughts they didn't agree with, that we were just going to hear it, full throttle. I think when he came along, he made it okay again to speak your mind, to say what you felt, to get out there and have a difference of opinion, knowing full well, and I think it's for a long time been the elephant in the room. We talk about liberals and we talk about the Democratic Party. I don't think that's the problem. I think it's much more severe these days than that. I honestly believe that the hard left has actually taken over the Democratic Party. And that unless we deal with that, and the first step in dealing with it is to get it out there and start addressing that there's a difference between being liberal-minded and being a hard leftist revolutionary from the 60s. If we don't start understanding that, we're going to, I think, have a more and more increasing national security problem with our own people. I think one of the biggest and most gravest threats we face today, and it's my opinion, is from the inside. And I think that we have to start getting that out there, and we have to be able to say something politically incorrect. And that is, look, I'm not a McCarthyite, I'm not one of those people, but there is another reason that you guys won't talk to as to why Hillary Clinton's emails and the Democratic National Committee's emails and all this were hacked and hacked successfully. It's because you people have an insider problem. Don't tell me after 40 years in law enforcement that you can have something like that happen to your party and it's almost on a daily basis for a long period of time and you don't have an insider problem. And don't also tell me that when you tell the FBI a number of months ago that they cannot come in and independently look at your computer system, don't tell me there's something good about that. That is a bad, bad idea. And my question is, what are they hiding? These are things we couldn't say before. We need to start saying them, because now that he's elected, I think that we have to start really getting into what is our national security problem here. And I think part of it is right here amongst us. And that may not be popular, but I think that one of the saddest things that happened at Watergate, and some of you in here may not remember Watergate, but a lot of us do. The Watergate situation was very bad, and I understand that. But I think we really overdid that when we disarmed the FBI. We changed the rules of collection of domestic intelligence. It may surprise you, but in America today, whether it's a local law enforcement agency, or it's the FBI, or it's any other agency, there is no domestic intelligence national security type collection effort on any law enforcement agency's part today. So that means that you don't do anything unless there's a specific predicated case. You don't go out in a community and start identifying, for example, some of those really the hardcore people that were in those protests, for example, over the weekend. There's no collection of information on those people. There's no FBI ongoing knowledge of how they were funded or how they got from Chicago to D.C. None of that, which is stuff we used to have back before Watergate. It was all done in when everybody decided the FBI has exceeded its boundaries. Why is that important? Because back then, remember the Communist Party USA? It was headed by a guy who was kind of a cartoon character type guy, but his name was Gus Hall. And he was married to Liz Hall. I know these people because on many weekends in the 70s, I and my colleagues were, waiting for them to get up to go right off to have coffee at breakfast, because we were following them everywhere they went. We were following them because they were getting money hand-delivered from the KGB. Every year in a Brooklyn parking lot, every single year, these people went over there. KGB agents would fly in. They'd have a bag with $1 million in it. And because the FBI, these two sources that were the bagmen for this money, were actually they had access to the highest levels of the Kremlin. They were so trusted. They were called the Morris brothers, and the Morris brothers decided at some point in time to turn on the Russians and help the FBI. And they are true national heroes because they gave us not only operations but thinking. And they would receive the money here in New York City, and then they would give it to Gus Hall in that parking lot. Gus would take it, and he and Liz would put it in their attic. So they were supposed to be financing the Communist Party of USA because they're very anti-capitalist. But they'd take this cash and they'd put it in the attic, and then when they went to the farmer's market on the weekend, they could go get some money and buy stuff. And it was kind of funny. One day they had a leak in their house, and they had to have work on the roof. The FBI New York gets a call from this repairman. He'd gone out there, and Liz and Gus had to leave. They totally didn't think about the attic thing. He goes up to take a look in the attic, and he opens the old attic door of this old house, and he starts to get showered with thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, and he thinks there's something wrong here. I better call the FBI. Anyway, my point is it does really happen, and the political correctness has to go, and we have to, I think, tighten up the rules a little bit. That's a long answer to your question, but yes. Okay, so I kind of think I heard two things. So on the protest part and all that, the FBI has really no involvement in any of that. I doubt if we have any knowledge or cases on anything like that, unless there's some violation of the terrorism statutes or some financial type, very delicate type of financial thing. Could have a predicated case on something like that. Now, as to terrorism, that's a great question. Remember back in Watergate, too, the whole idea of follow the money, and that's how you'll get to the problems in Watergate. Well, it's the same thing now. Follow the money is, in any case, like some of these international terrorism cases, very important. And so with the 1996 Anti-Terrorism Act, and with a lot of legislation that was passed after 9/11, which gave us much broader authority in terrorism cases, in tracking money, in doing financial investigations, particularly overseas. We got a much broader authority. So part of the counterterrorism effort this day and age is directly aimed at a number of cases which try to trace and track money to see where it's flowing. So I'll give you an example. If Iran is, and they are, is funding Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is then taking that funding and turning it into attacks on Israel, we want to know with precision, where is this money coming from? How did it get to Iran? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? And then who actually picks it up at the other end? Those kind of things are actually going on, and they're a big part, kind of in the background. They're not as sexy as the terrorists and being out there watching them, but they're a big part of trying to find out where those people are and what they're doing and what they might do next. And so there's a lot of cases like that. And that's why the Bureau, by the way, hires accountants. Because the rest of us would never be able to get anything like that off first base. Yes. I think we just sit and wait to hear. It probably changes daily. I honestly don't know. I think like you all, you were probably watching when Director Comey came out in July, and he started, my two friends, Tom Weston and Dan O'Connell are over here, used to work with, and I'm sure you guys were thinking the same thing. We're watching this, and Director Comey is outlining this case for indicting Hillary Clinton, actually. It's what it sounded like to me. Am I wrong? Didn't it sound like that to you? And then he gets to the punchline, and he doesn't. So it's like, I don't know. But again, this was like an alternate reality, because if I were the director of the FBI, I'd say, look, yeah, I did it differently, but by the way, everybody over there that is my, quote, boss, they had to excuse themselves because they'd been busy having meetings on an airplane on a runway at a tarmac in Phoenix with the husband of the subject of our case. So nothing that was going on back there at the time was normal. And I thought it was interesting, though. One of the things, I'll get to you, sir, in just a second. One of the things that's interesting, though, that I thought, if you were like a boss, or you were like, somebody worked for you, they were like really doing something significant for you, kind of like Hillary Clinton was, running for president, had been Secretary of State. She's under investigation, but then a former president, her husband, meets your attorney general on an airplane. If you were president, wouldn't you have an absolute public fit? But you heard nothing. I thought that was fascinating. Yes. Well, I don't know what the FBI thinks of that. I have my own opinions. Again, I think that, in my opinion, as I said earlier, I think the Democratic Party is really run now by the hard left. Bernie Sanders ran for president. He was married in a communist country. The idea. Here's the thing that really bothers me a lot. The president went to Cuba during a time when a terrible terrorist attack had taken place in Europe. He's watching a baseball game, and I won't say, maybe for exaggeration, he's got his arm around Raul Castro, one of the most vicious, terrible demons in the face of the earth. And then he normalizes relations with Cuba and compares himself to Nixon, which is not at all a comparison here. And then he walks away and leaves Joanne Chesimard, a police officer killer, the killer of a trooper in New Jersey, back a number of years ago. He leaves her sitting there with a sanctuary, and here she is on the FBI's top 10. I just don't think that these people have the same feelings about this country that most of us do. And I don't know what happened along the way, but I think you could make a good argument, again, that there are many, many examples, and you could really have fun researching this, that the hard left that used to be protesting and demonstrating and was not anti-Vietnam, by the way. They were anti-America, American government. They wanted the government brought down. Many of those kinds of people and those kinds of thoughts processes are now in Congress and in the Senate. And I think that's very dangerous. I think it's very, very dangerous.